It was supposed to be another silent night on Africa's frontier. The villages along Burkina Faso's southeastern border had grown used to stillness, an uneasy calm after decades of foreign patrols, mercenary whispers, and shifting shadows. But just past midnight, that silence cracked. A strange hum filled the air. From the darkness, glowing eyes appeared unmanned drones circling overhead like hawks that had finally chosen their prey. Moments later, fire rained down with surgical precision. A convoy of vehicles, their cargo still unknown, was reduced to twisted steel and black smoke curling against the dawn. By sunrise, the world awoke not to rumor, but to headlines impossible to ignore: drone strike in Burkina Faso. But this was no ordinary incident. For decades, the monopoly on drone warfare belonged to superpowers with billion-dollar budgets and global military networks. Yet here, in a so-called peripheral state, a new chapter was written. The silence that followed was not filled with denial, but with confirmation. President Ibrahim Traoré's office admitted, yes, the order came from the highest level. For the first time in modern African history, a leader openly took responsibility for launching a strike with advanced technology once thought exclusive to the West. So the question hangs heavy: was this the reckless gamble of a small nation, or the calculated birth of a new doctrine where Africa defends its sovereignty not just with words but with tools once denied to it? This is more than a story of explosions in the night. It is about dignity, survival, and the shifting balance of global power. And it is a story that asks all of us: do you believe that Africa, led by voices like President Ibrahim Traoré, is finally drawing its red line? Please share this if you feel sovereignty is not negotiable, and subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines. The confirmation came swiftly. Unlike the usual dance of denials and vague statements that so often follow military incidents in Africa, there was no attempt to hide. Within hours of the strike, the office of President Ibrahim Traoré announced to the world, yes, this was our order, and it was deliberate. For the first time in Burkina Faso's history, its head of state openly accepted responsibility for a drone strike. To many Africans, it felt like the end of a long silence. For decades, drone warfare was a weapon reserved for Washington, Paris, or London, tools wielded in the Sahel without local consent, often leaving villages scarred and sovereignty dismissed. But here was a different image. A young African president, unapologetic, standing behind his nation's first strike of this kind. The weapon itself shocked analysts. Intelligence identified it as the NA-7, a North Korean prototype that had been refitted with Russian navigation systems and then adapted by local engineers to function within AESnet, the encrypted security framework now linking Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This was not a borrowed drone from a Western ally, nor an off-the-shelf commercial device. It was something far more unsettling for the old order, a system born of unconventional partnerships, refined through African initiative, and deployed with surgical precision. What made the NA-7 stand out was not just its range, nearly 800 kilometers, giving it the ability to strike deep into hostile territory, but its guidance. Instead of relying on vulnerable satellite relays, it used AI-driven navigation integrated into AESnet. In the words of one defense analyst, it was a clean blade in a region long scarred by imprecise and devastating Western strikes. For once, an African state had demonstrated superior efficiency, completing the mission in just 12 minutes from command to execution with no collateral damage reported. The target was not random. Days before the operation, Burkina Faso's intelligence services had intercepted chilling communications tied to a plan named Operation Broken Spine. The goal was nothing less than the sabotage of the Koudougou Oil Refinery, a $1.3 billion facility that had become the crown jewel of Burkina Faso's march toward energy independence. Built with partners outside the traditional Western orbit, the refinery symbolized something far greater than industrial steel. It represented freedom from decades of dependency on imported fuel. The plan was clear: cripple the refinery before it reached full capacity, deny Burkina Faso the projected $400 million in annual revenues, and send a warning to any African nation daring to control its own resources. When the convoy appeared near the southeastern border under the cover of darkness, it was not seen as a mere logistical movement. Intelligence matched it to the sabotage timeline, explosives, armed units, and a route that pointed directly toward the refinery. The decision was swift. Allowing that convoy to pass would mean accepting vulnerability, accepting that Africa's future spine could be broken before it even straightened. Striking it meant risk, but also survival. By dawn, the risk had been taken. The convoy was reduced to metal fragments scattered across the dirt smoke curling into the morning air. What investigators later uncovered among the wreckage would send even greater shockwaves. American-made rifles, radios with French serial codes, maps of resource corridors printed in English, and perhaps most troubling military ID tags linked to former Nigerian special forces. To Burkina Faso citizens, it confirmed their deepest fears that mercenaries, multinationals, and covert hands were conspiring to shatter their sovereignty. Yet, to those same citizens, it also felt like vindication. For once, their nation had not waited to be struck. It had acted first decisively and on its own terms. The silence of the night had been broken by more than explosions. It had been broken by the unmistakable sound of a small state declaring, "We will not bow to the shadows." The strike alone was enough to make headlines, but it was what followed the revelations, the coded threats, and the reactions that transformed a midnight explosion into a continental turning point. At the crash site, forensic teams combed through the wreckage. What they found lifted the story from mystery to full-blown intrigue. Among the twisted frames of vehicles lay American-manufactured rifles and encrypted radios with French serial numbers. Maps marked with English annotations showed resource corridors cutting through the Sahel. More shocking still, investigators recovered military ID tags tied to former Nigerian special forces, raising disturbing questions. Were neighboring soldiers knowingly participating in sabotage, or were they pawns in a larger game manipulated by foreign sponsors? Either way, the evidence suggested that Burkina Faso had not destroyed mere smugglers. It had intercepted a covert operation of staggering scale. Then came the intelligence leak. Burkina Faso analysts revealed the chilling codename Operation Broken Spine. Its target was not just any installation, but the Koudougou Oil Refinery, the very backbone of the nation's push for energy independence. The timeline was precise. Within 72 hours, coordinated attacks would cripple the refinery before it launched at full capacity. The symbolism was brutal. To break the refinery was to break the spine of a country daring to stand upright. The urgency pushed leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger into an emergency meeting in Ouagadougou. Phones were confiscated, cameras barred. The atmosphere was heavy, tense, and alive with the knowledge that history was being written in real time. Out of that closed chamber leaked one phrase that electrified the continent: "If they send ghosts, we send thunder." It was Traoré's declaration, a warning that Africa would no longer absorb covert attacks in silence. The decision that emerged was swift and uncompromising. The strike was not a rogue act of recklessness, but the opening salvo of a collective defense doctrine. That night birthed what would soon be called Operation Iron Shield. For the first time, Sahel states pledged to fuse their intelligence, share satellite data from new Russian and Chinese partnerships, and integrate air patrols under a unified command. What outsiders had dismissed as weak, fragmented militaries were now declaring an attack on one is an attack on all. The reaction among ordinary citizens was immediate and visceral. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, tens of thousands gathered with flags and chants. In Bamako and Niamey, murals appeared overnight showing drones painted not as instruments of fear, but as symbols of African self-defense. Hashtags surged across social media. Yarn Sahel Rising, Senor, Don't Mess with Sovereignty, amassing millions of impressions within days. A remix of Traoré's thunderous declaration, set to Afrobeat rhythms, became an anthem for university students from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Culture itself became part of the resistance. Graffiti artists scrawled, "Sovereignty is not negotiable," across city walls. Spoken word poets performed verses casting the drone strike as a David versus Goliath moment. Street vendors sold t-shirts with the slogan, "Don't mess with sovereignty," in bold letters. Even in the diaspora, African youth posted videos reenacting the drama of that night, drawing millions of views. What began as a military act had morphed into a cultural uprising. But outside the Sahel, reactions were far less celebratory. In Washington, cautious voices urged restraint and dialogue, signaling unease, but avoiding outright condemnation. In Paris, the tone was sharper. Officials warned that such unilateral strikes threatened regional stability and undermined international security frameworks. European media headlines blared warnings of Africa on fire and unpredictable Traoré. NATO experts fretted over the emergence of drone warfare in African hands, painting it as reckless escalation. Financial markets felt the tremors too. Energy investors whispered of risk premiums climbing across the Sahel, warning that contracts worth billions could unravel if similar strikes became the norm. Analysts calculated potential losses of $10 to $20 billion annually if foreign corporations could no longer operate under the old assumptions of impunity. For those who had long extracted Africa's resources without resistance, the message was chilling. The game had changed. And yet for many Africans, those criticisms only underscored the truth. This was not chaos. It was clarity. For once, an African leader had refused to wait passively for sabotage. He had acted preemptively, defiantly, and publicly. To his citizens, Traoré was not reckless, he was protective. To his critics abroad, he was dangerous precisely because he had shown that a small nation could stand tall. The midnight drone strike had started as a single operation, but in its aftermath, it became something larger, a declaration of doctrine, a rallying cry for sovereignty, and the spark for a cultural movement that no one, least of all the old powers of the West, could afford to ignore. The drone strike did more than neutralize a convoy, it shattered assumptions about power in Africa. Its immediate impact rippled far beyond the battlefield, reshaping politics, society, and the daily lives of ordinary people. Inside Burkina Faso, the effect was electric. Citizens who had long felt defenseless against mercenaries and foreign schemes suddenly saw their government as capable of more than speeches. Tens of thousands poured into Independence Square, waving flags and chanting slogans. To them, Traoré's action was not just military. It was deeply personal. It meant their oil, their land, their children's future would not be left unprotected. Street vendors sold T-shirts emblazoned with "Don't mess with sovereignty." Graffiti artists painted murals of drones, transformed into shields of protection. For the first time in decades, sovereignty was no longer an abstract idea, it was a lived reality. The refinery at Koudougou became a new national symbol. It wasn't just industrial steel and machinery, it was hope. Families spoke of the projected $400 million in revenues and what it could mean: schools with proper roofs, clinics stocked with medicine, universities that didn't require young people to flee abroad. Protecting the refinery became a point of pride. To lose it would have meant returning to dependency forever, buying back fuel at inflated prices from the very powers who had once looted their resources. The drone strike gave people confidence that their government was willing to defend that dream no matter the cost. Politically, the event hardened Burkina Faso's stance on sovereignty. The Sahel Doctrine, announced in the aftermath, declared that any foreign force operating without transparency or registration would be treated as hostile. This was not rhetoric. Within weeks, French troops quietly withdrew from remote outposts, acknowledging the rising costs of intervention. Analysts in Europe estimated that maintaining influence in the Sahel had already cost France $4.6 billion annually, a figure now seen as unsustainable in the face of new risks. By shifting the burden of pressure back onto outsiders, Traoré's government flipped the script. Intervention was no longer cheap or easy. The ripple spread to the regional level, with Operation Iron Shield. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger committed to collective defense. For decades, African militaries had been portrayed as fragmented and dependent. Suddenly, they were pooling resources, integrating communications, and conducting joint patrols without Western oversight. The symbolism was profound. Security was no longer subcontracted, it was African-led. Yet these bold steps also came with dangers. Western governments debated sanctions. International investors began to factor Sahel risk into their models, warning of higher costs and disrupted contracts. Critics inside Africa worried that confrontation could escalate, bringing economic retaliation that ordinary citizens would bear. Could a nation already struggling with poverty and insecurity endure the backlash of defying global powers? Despite those fears, the psychological shift was undeniable. For decades, many Africans had lived with the feeling that sovereignty was fragile, conditional, something granted only at the mercy of outsiders. The drone strike changed that perception. It showed that sovereignty could be defended decisively with African technology, African intelligence, and African will. This was the true legacy of the night, not the destruction of a convoy, but the birth of a mindset. In classrooms, teachers spoke about the strike as a lesson in dignity. In marketplaces, traders debated politics with newfound pride. And in the homes of Burkina Faso, parents told their children that their nation was no longer a pawn, it was a player. The shockwaves from the drone strike reached far beyond Ouagadougou. In Washington, the incident landed on the desks of security advisors like an unwelcome surprise. For years, the US had treated drone warfare as its own strategic domain, a tool to project power across distant battlefields. Now, a small West African nation had demonstrated capabilities that rivaled American precision, and worse, it had done so openly under the direct command of its head of state. The official U.S. response was cautious. A State Department spokesperson urged restraint and dialogue, careful not to escalate. Yet behind closed doors, analysts debated the deeper implications. If Burkina Faso could strike preemptively with an advanced drone, what would prevent other African nations from following the same path? Could American bases in the Sahel, already politically unpopular, become liabilities overnight? One internal memo leaked to the press put it bluntly: the cost of intervention is rising beyond sustainability. Paris, by contrast, reacted with sharpness. French officials warned that Burkina Faso's actions threatened regional stability and undermined international security frameworks. The language was telling France, once the dominant power in West Africa, now found itself on the defensive. Every drone strike that Burkina Faso carried out was a reminder that Paris no longer dictated the terms of security in the Sahel. French media headlines reflected this anxiety, casting Ibrahim Traoré as unpredictable, reckless, even dangerous. Yet on African social media, those same headlines were shared with pride as proof that the old colonial masters were rattled. The European Union and NATO echoed France's concern, but their statements revealed unease more than confidence. To them, the danger was not just military, it was symbolic. If African nations began asserting sovereignty with advanced tools, the legitimacy of Western-led missions across the continent would be called into question. Billions invested in peacekeeping, counterterrorism, and resource contracts could unravel in months. Global markets felt the tremor as well. Energy investors issued warnings that the Sahel had become a high-risk zone, predicting potential losses of $10 to $20 billion annually if contracts were disrupted. Insurance firms quietly raised premiums for companies operating in the region. Yet for many Africans, these financial ripples were almost satisfying. The same corporations that had extracted easy profits for decades were finally calculating the true cost of ignoring African sovereignty. Beyond the West, the reactions told a different story. In Moscow and Beijing, officials remained measured but clearly intrigued. Russian commentators praised the efficiency of the Na-7 drone, noting its integration into AESnet as a game-changer. Chinese media highlighted the strike as evidence of a multipolar world taking shape. For both powers, Burkina Faso's defiance offered opportunities, partnerships, influence, and leverage against the West. But perhaps the most profound reaction came not from governments, but from ordinary citizens around the world. In African diasporas across Europe and the United States, young people shared clips of Traoré's declaration, "If you send agents in the shadows, don't be surprised when we send fire." The video went viral, drawing millions of views. For communities long accustomed to seeing African leaders portrayed as weak or submissive, this was something radically different. It was a vision of Africa standing tall, drawing its own red line. The question now hangs over global politics: will Western powers double down, using sanctions and covert operations to contain this defiance? Or are we witnessing the emergence of a multipolar era where Africa asserts not just moral claims, but military and technological capacity? What began as a single drone strike in the dead of night has become a mirror. For Washington, Paris, and London, it reflects a challenge they did not expect. For Moscow and Beijing, it signals opportunity. And for millions of Africans, it shines with the possibility that sovereignty is no longer negotiable. The night of the drone strike may have lasted only minutes, but its echoes will be heard for years. In the smoke that rose above the southeastern border of Burkina Faso, the world saw more than the destruction of a convoy. It saw the unveiling of a doctrine, a statement that Africa would no longer live by rules written elsewhere. For the Burkinabe people, the meaning was clear. Sovereignty was no longer a word tossed around in speeches. It was a shield defended by technology, intelligence, and the will to act first when threatened. For the Sahel Alliance, it marked the birth of Operation Iron Shield, a collective defense that promised no African nation would stand alone. And for the wider continent, it was a signal that the age of submission may finally be over. Yet the celebration carries its shadow. Powerful adversaries do not simply step aside. Already murmurs of sanctions, covert retaliation, and economic pressure ripple through Western capitals. History reminds us that whenever nations break free from dependency, the pushback is fierce. The question is whether Africa's unity and its new tools of defense will hold when the storm comes. The refinery at Koudougou saved in that midnight strike embodies this dilemma. It stands as a symbol of independence, yet also as a target. Protecting it will require not just drones in the sky, but resilience in politics, culture, and the economy. The real battle may not be fought in explosions, but in contracts, currencies, and the hearts of young Africans deciding what kind of future they want. And so we are left with a haunting choice. Will this doctrine of sovereignty sharpened in the fire of that night spread across Africa and redefine the balance of global power? Or will foreign interests succeed in fragmenting the unity before it takes root? President Ibrahim Traoré closed his speech with words that still ring like thunder. Fear is for those who borrow power. We built ours. To his supporters, it was the birth of a new Africa. To his opponents, it was the start of a dangerous era. To history, it may be remembered as the moment Africa drew its red line. Now, I turn the question to you. Do you believe that this red line drawn not on paper, but in action can truly protect Africa's sovereignty? Or will it invite retaliation that tests the continent's resolve? Please share this video if you believe sovereignty is not negotiable. And subscribe if you believe, like us, that dignity must never be borrowed, it must be built.